Do you have an Ethiopian Bible here?
Yes, we have.
Is it up there?
Yes.
Is it different than Ge'ez?
For centuries, some of the oldest Christian texts on earth were not hidden in Rome or Jerusalem, but in the mountains of Ethiopia. And according to Ethiopian monks, one page was never meant to be read at all.
In the highlands of northern Ethiopia, inside a monastery older than the Roman Catholic Church, monks have guarded a page that Western Christianity voted to destroy in 363 AD. Whatever Mel Gibson said about that Bible, scholars spent years dismissing it as the opinion of a Hollywood director with a theology obsession. They are not dismissing it anymore.
My contention is, when I was making it, it was like, you're making this film, and the idea was that we're all responsible for this, that his sacrifice was for all mankind.
Because monks at Abba Garima Monastery in northern Ethiopia have just released a translation of a passage that Western Christianity formally voted to destroy in the year 363 AD. A page that the early church fathers quoted as Holy Scripture. A page that the New Testament itself references directly. A page that, once the Roman councils decided it was too dangerous, was hunted down and erased from every Bible on earth. Every Bible except one. And Mel Gibson, the man who spent 12 years and $30 million of his own money researching the most historically precise biblical film ever made, had been pointing at this exact passage for years. Nobody listened. Now the translation is out, and what it describes is not the Jesus most of the world was taught about. What it describes is something so vast, so cosmic, and so structurally incompatible with institutional Christianity that you begin to understand immediately why they buried it. That alone would have been enough to rewrite the textbooks. But the monks were not done. To understand what just came out of that monastery, you need to understand where it has been hiding, and for how long, and why the people who hid it were terrified of what would happen if the wrong hands ever found it. We are not talking about a rumor. We are not talking about a fragment. We are talking about a complete, authenticated text, written in Ge'ez, the ancient liturgical language of Ethiopia.
Long before it was the religion of the Roman Empire, it was the religion here in Ethiopia. Ethiopia was the first Christian kingdom in the world.
A language so old it stopped being spoken on the streets around the same time Rome was still an empire. Copied by hand across 1,500 years of wars, invasions, droughts, and the slow collapse of every civilization that tried to conquer the Horn of Africa. Kept alive inside stone walls by monks who never received a single council decree from Rome, because Rome's decrees never reached them. The monastery is called Abba Garima. It sits in the Tigray region of northern Ethiopia, carved into a highland ridge at roughly 2,000 meters above sea level. The air is thin and dry. The stone walls are thick enough to keep out an army. The monks who live there follow a rule of life established around the year 494 AD, which means this community has been continuously operational for longer than the entire history of Islam, longer than the printing press, longer than the European discovery of the Americas. These men have been copying and guarding the same manuscripts since before Charlemagne was born. French manuscript expert Jacques Mercier visited the monastery in the year 2000 and was granted permission to examine what scholars now consider the oldest surviving illuminated Christian manuscripts in the world. He found 2 bound volumes, designated Garima I and Garima II, handwritten in Ge'ez, their parchment so fragile it crumbled at the edges when touched. Subsequent radiocarbon analysis, conducted on small detached fragments, proposed dates for Garima II between approximately 390 and 570 AD. That places these documents in the same century as the fall of Rome. Older than the Quran, older than any Bible you have ever held in your hands. The monastery also holds something else. Something that does not appear in any Western Bible. Something the monks refer to simply as the text that was not sent back, because the decree that condemned it never arrived. And that is where this story shifts into a completely different register. Start with the number 81. That is how many books the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church considers canonical scripture. The Protestant Bible contains 66. The Catholic Bible contains 73. The Ethiopian Bible contains 81. That means there are 15 books in active liturgical use inside Ethiopian Christianity that no Western Protestant has ever read in church. Books that were not suppressed in secret. Books that were openly included in a canon that has existed continuously since the 4th century. Books that scholars at Oxford, Cambridge, and Princeton have studied for decades. Books that shaped the entire theological vocabulary of early Christianity before the councils decided to simplify the menu. One book sits at the center of all of it. the Book of Enoch. If you have never heard that name, that is not an accident. In 363 AD, the Council of Laodicea formally excluded it. And by the time that exclusion took effect across the Roman world, copies were already disappearing. Early church fathers who had previously quoted Enoch as Holy Scripture, men like Tertullian, Irenaeus, Clement of Alexandria, and Justin Martyr, had cited it as authoritative text. Tertullian had called it, in his own words, Holy Scripture. That is not a marginal figure with a fringe opinion. That is one of the most influential theologians in the entire history of the Western Church. And the book he called Holy Scripture was later voted out of existence. It did not disappear from existence. It disappeared from the Western world. In Ethiopia, no vote had been taken, no decree had arrived. The monks kept copying. If you're finding this fascinating, a like truly helps this channel continue investigating these buried histories. Here is the detail that should stop you completely. The New Testament quotes the Book of Enoch directly. The Epistle of Jude, canonical scripture found in every Protestant and Catholic Bible on earth, contains this line in verses 14 and 15. Enoch, the seventh from Adam, prophesied, saying, "Behold, the Lord cometh with 10,000s of his saints, to execute judgment upon all." That is a direct quotation, not a paraphrase, not a loose reference, a word-for-word citation from 1 Enoch chapter 1, verse 9. Modern scholars confirm this definitively when 11 Aramaic language fragments of the Book of Enoch were discovered in Cave 4 at Qumran in 1948, the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Aramaic text matched the Ge'ez text that Ethiopian monks had been copying for over a millennium. Exactly. Scholars used those Qumran fragments to verify the reliability of the Ethiopian copies and concluded that the Ethiopian text had been faithfully preserved without alteration. Think about what that means. The Dead Sea Scrolls prove that the Book of Enoch Jude quoted in the New Testament is the same book that Ethiopian monks had been guarding inside stone walls in the Tigray highlands. The same book, the same text. Jude quoted it as prophecy, and the Council of Laodicea outlawed it 70 years later. The New Testament held the citation. The source material was destroyed. Future generations inherited the conclusion without the premise that created it. They were handed a portrait of Christ built from a framework they were never told existed. The data was clear. The implications were anything but. This is where Mel Gibson enters the story, and this is where the story becomes impossible to ignore. In 2004, Gibson released The Passion of the Christ. Whatever you think of the film, the research behind it is documented. Gibson spent 12 years preparing. He immersed himself in primary sources, ancient languages, patristic writings, pre-medieval theological frameworks, and traditions that did not originate in Rome. His production team worked with consultants in biblical archaeology and early church history. The film used reconstructed Aramaic and Latin dialogue. The level of source engagement was unprecedented for a Hollywood production. When Gibson began publicly referencing the Ethiopian Bible and its canon of 81 books, he was not speaking as a casual enthusiast. He was speaking as someone who had spent over a decade in those texts. His claim, repeated across multiple public contexts, was direct. The Ethiopian Bible contains entire teachings of Jesus that were cut from Western scripture, post-resurrection teachings, passages about the end of days, passages about false institutions built in his name, passages that describe a Christ of absolute cosmic authority, whose presence restructures reality at its foundations. Gibson called this, in his own characterization, the most important biblical discovery the Western world refuses to discuss. And critics laughed, and scholars called it Hollywood sensationalism. And the monks in Tigray kept their silence, until now. This is where the story splits. One path leads to conventional explanation. The other leads somewhere far more uncomfortable. In September 2025, the Ethiopian Heritage Authority announced the discovery of what researchers described as the most significant collection of early Christian manuscripts found in a century, located in a remote monastery in the Tigray region. The collection included complete copies of texts previously known only through fragments, including a complete 4th century codex containing the 4 canonical Gospels, alongside 6 other Gospel texts arranged in an order that suggests a fundamentally different understanding of scriptural authority than what later became standard. The Ethiopian government announced a partnership with international cultural organizations to digitally preserve and study the manuscripts before releasing them to scholars worldwide. But it was a separate, more specific release that generated the deepest response in theological circles. Monks at Abba Garima, acting according to a tradition tradition of their own, a tradition that says sacred texts are released only when the burden of understanding can be carried, chose this moment to release a formally translated passage from the Enochic tradition preserved in their archive. A passage that describes the figure at the center of the New Testament not as the pastoral shepherd of Renaissance painting, but as what earlier sources called the Son of Man, a title that appears 82 times in the Gospels, and whose full meaning, scholars now argue, was only coherent if you had read Enoch. In the Book of Enoch, the Son of Man is not a humble carpenter. He is a pre-existent cosmic being who was present before the creation of the sun and the stars. He presides over the judgment of fallen angels. He holds authority over time itself. The Enochic tradition describes his arrival not as a gentle dawn, but as a cosmic event that ruptures the fabric of existing order. And according to Enochic scholar Margaret Barker of King's College London, who spent decades studying the connections between Enochic literature and the New Testament, the Gospel writers appear to have assumed their readers had already read Enoch. They wrote in its vocabulary, they borrowed its framework, and when the Council of Laodicea erased that framework, it left billions of future readers holding conclusions that no longer connected to their source. Gibson's film starts with the fallen angels. The Ethiopian tradition says the story begins there. The overlap, as observers have noted, is exact. The team sat in silence for a while after reviewing what had been released. Nobody quite knew what to say, because the page the monks translated is not merely a historical artifact, it is a structural argument. It is the root system beneath a tree that Western Christianity had been worshipping for 17 centuries, without understanding where its branches actually came from. Some scholars argue the page should be understood narrowly, as a theological expression specific to one tradition, not a universal corrective. They point out that canon formation, while complex, was not simply conspiracy. Communities in Rome, Alexandria, Antioch, Constantinople, and Axum all developed their own textual traditions, reflecting regional theological priorities. The exclusion of Enoch, they say, reflected doctrinal concerns about authorship and theological consistency, not deliberate deception. These are serious scholars making serious arguments, and they deserve to be heard. But here's the complication they have not fully answered. If the exclusion was purely doctrinal, if it was simply a matter of theological coherence, why does the text that was excluded appear verbatim inside the text that was kept? Why does the Epistle of Jude quote from a book the church then voted to destroy? You cannot simultaneously declare a source authoritative enough to appear in canonical scripture and illegitimate enough to burn. The logical structure does not hold. And the monks at Abagarima, who never received the decree and therefore never had to rationalize it, preserved the evidence of that contradiction in stone-walled silence for 1600 years. Zoom out far enough, and the pattern becomes visible. In the early centuries of Christianity, there was no single Bible. There were competing traditions, circulating texts, regional canons, and enormous theological diversity. The process of canonization was not revelation, it was selection. In Rome and Constantinople, councils voted on which texts supported institutional unity and which texts complicated it. Texts emphasizing direct spiritual experience, cosmic warfare, angelic hierarchies, and pre-institutional forms of authority were systematically excluded. Texts that supported a clear chain of command, from God to the institution to the believer, were retained. Ethiopia followed a different path. Geographically isolated by mountains and deserts from the centers of Mediterranean power, spiritually rooted in a pre-Roman form of African Christianity that traced its lineage to the 1st century, the Ethiopian Orthodox Church never became subject to Roman doctrinal enforcement. When Islam expanded across North Africa in the 7th century and cut Ethiopia off from what remained of its Mediterranean connections, the isolation became total. No papal council could reach them. No decree of suppression could arrive. The monks kept copying the 81 books, all of them, including the one that had been formally destroyed everywhere else. One controversial interpretation, advanced by certain scholars of early Christianity, suggests the suppression was not purely about theology, that the Book of Enoch's description of the Son of Man as a pre-institutional cosmic authority, a being whose judgment falls on corrupted religious structures as readily as on individual sinners, was precisely what made it too dangerous to preserve inside an institution that was consolidating power. A Christ who judges fallen angels and corrupt priests with equal authority is a fundamentally different figure from a Christ whose authority flows through ordained channels. The text was not lost, it was removed, and Ethiopia never got the memo. If we take the evidence at face value, the Dead Sea Scrolls confirmation, the Judy citation, the Garima Gospels dating, the September 2025 manuscript release, we are looking at a tradition that preserved the original framework of Christian cosmology intact, not because of a conspiracy, but because of geography, isolation, and the extraordinary discipline of monks who copied the same words by hand, generation after generation, inside stone walls that no imperial decree ever penetrated. Stand inside Abba Garima Monastery in your imagination for a moment. The light comes through narrow windows. The air smells of incense and old parchment. A monk sits at a low table, dipping a reed pen into carbon black ink, reproducing letters from a manuscript his teacher received from his teacher's teacher, stretching back in an unbroken chain to men who were contemporaries of the apostles. He is not preserving a secret. He is doing what his community has always done. He has no particular awareness that 5,000 miles away, in institutions built on a different model of authority, the text he is copying was declared forbidden before his monastery was a century old. That monk is why we know what we know. James Bruce, the Scottish explorer, traveled to Ethiopia in 1773 after hearing rumors of a Book of Enoch still alive in African Christianity. He brought 3 Ge'ez copies back to Britain. European scholars did not know what to do with them. The text was too strange, too cosmic, too structurally incompatible with the theology that 17 centuries of canon formation had built. It took decades before the academic world began to take seriously what Ethiopian monks had never stopped treating as scripture. Now, 250 years after Bruce's journey, the digital age has done something those stone walls could not have anticipated. The translation released from Abagarima does not stay inside a monastery. It moves. Within hours of its circulation, universities, theological institutes, and biblical research centers on 4 continents had submitted requests for access to the manuscript. Scholars of ancient languages confirmed features consistent with early Ge'ez manuscript traditions. Structural patterns matching other preserved Enochic literature, marginal annotations suggesting layered interpretation across multiple generations of scribal engagement, and theological phrasing linked directly to early church writings from the 2nd and 3rd centuries, writings that predate the Council of Laodicea's vote. The evidence does not require you to accept that the church acted in bad faith. It only requires you to accept that something was lost, and that it was kept intact in a place nobody thought to look. Consider the timeline one more time. In 363 AD, the Council of Laodicea excludes the Book of Enoch from the biblical canon. Copies disappear across the Roman world. In the 5th century, as the Roman Empire fractures and falls, the theological infrastructure built on its councils begins enforcing doctrinal uniformity. The cosmic Christ of the Enochic tradition, the pre-existent Son of Man who presides over the judgment of fallen heavenly beings, fades from Western Christianity. The pastoral Christ, the suffering servant, the figure of institutional mediation, takes his place. In Ethiopia, none of this happens. The Aksumite kingdom embraces Christianity in the 4th century under King Ezana. The texts arrive before the suppression can follow them. By the time Islamic expansion isolates Ethiopia from Mediterranean influence in the 7th century, the canon is already fixed at 81 books, and it stays there, unchanged, for 1,400 years. In 1948, Bedouin shepherds find clay jars in the caves of Qumran. Inside, the Dead Sea Scrolls. Inside the Dead Sea Scrolls, 11 fragments of the Book of Enoch in Aramaic, the language Jesus spoke. Scholars verify they match the Ethiopian copies exactly. The book that was forbidden was not corrupted. It was preserved. In Ethiopia. In 2025, the Ethiopian Heritage Authority announces the most significant manuscript discovery in a century. Monks at Abba Garima release a translation of a passage from the Enochic tradition that has never previously been made available outside their order. The passage describes the Son of Man, and the description does not resemble the figure in any Western Bible. Mel Gibson had been describing this figure for years, and the people who called him a conspiracy theorist now have a translated ancient text to explain. What do you do with this? That is the question the monks at Abba Garima appear to have been sitting with for a very long time. One monk reportedly described their tradition of selective release with a single sentence. "Knowledge has weight," he said. "If you lift it too early, it breaks the one who holds it." They waited until they believed the weight could be carried. The scholarly debate over the specific passage's implications will continue for years. Theologians will argue over authenticity, transmission, and interpretation. Some will insist the distinction between Ethiopia's canon and Rome's is historical rather than conspiratorial, a difference of tradition, not suppression. They are not wrong, but they are also not accounting for the Jude citation. They are not accounting for Tertullian. They are not accounting for the fact that the text the monks preserved was confirmed, letter for letter, by the Dead Sea Scrolls. And they are not accounting for the fact that Mel Gibson, working from the same sources, spending 12 years in the same textual traditions, arrived at the same portrait of Christ that the monks at Abba Garima have been copying since the 6th century. Whatever the passage ultimately means for Christian theology, one thing is no longer in question. The page existed. The church knew it existed. The Council of Laodicea voted on it in 363 AD. The vote failed to reach one monastery in northern Ethiopia. And for 1600 years, while empires rose and collapsed and the printed Bible spread across the world, monks in the Tigray highlands kept copying, in a language only they could read, a text only they preserved. The page survived. Mel Gibson was right about where it was hiding. The question that remains, the one that no ecclesiastical council and no Hollywood production can fully answer, is whether the West is ready to understand what it actually says.